Good afternoon, everybody. Henry, probably I should start with disclaimer that I've read all of your books. I told you about that. And I read them at the different stages of my life. So the first time when I read Dr. Henry Marsh's book, I lost my dad. And I was blaming all doctors around myself for not finding the diagnosis in the right time. I thought that it could be better healthcare service. So when I read the book of Dr. Henry Marsh that I got, by accident somewhere, I somehow forgave all the doctors because I realized there is no angels, there is no gods in white robes, and it did help me to move forward. The second time when I was reading the book, we were building our reconstructive surgery department, and I started reading that as a methodology material, how the hospital should look like, how surgeons look like, and it did help us to build it in the right way. And the third time I was reading the last part of the last book of Dr. Henry Marsh 2 days before our meeting here, and I thought, why I'm reading this? Everything was said before, but it was, again, in a very right time because I had a lot of insights, and the book was finished with a phrase that the war started in Ukraine, and I don't know whether I ever going to be back in Ukraine. So you're back in Ukraine. How it feels?
Well, it's about my fifth or sixth visit since the war started. And of course, I first came here 32 years ago. Well, I've only been to Lviv and Kiev, although I know what's going on in Odessa and the east. And of course, it is a slight sense of unreality, and particularly Kiev this week, there was not a single air raid alert. So it's very strange that superficially life looks normal, but death is everywhere. And then when I came to see your absolutely fantastic superheroes place a few days ago, and you see these limbless soldiers, and that brings even more the reality to your face.
I was really, pleased to have Henry Marsh on our ergotherapy kitchen. So now I can tell everyone that I had Henry Marsh on the kitchen, and we had a very nice kitchen conversation. But it was really very cool, and that's anything changed in Ukraine, from your opinion?
To my eyes, no, not really. I mean, it's been changing all the time. I've been coming since 1992 after independence. But superficially, life seems to be going on as normal in Lviv and Kiev, but I know that that is superficial. And beneath that, people are living very intense lives, because the future is so utterly uncertain, and the cautious optimism last year has now evaporated, and you're faced by the prospect of seemingly an endless conflict with no obvious end in sight. So that is a very, very strange situation to be in.
Well, we in Superhumans actually we are non-stop optimists, but I think it's not a real world. What is Superhumans? It's a bubble, because we work with people who are not supposed to be alive. They were occasionally saved. Their evacuation lasted for 5-6 hours. I told you we have a patient who was evacuated for 21 hours through the minefield. So when you look at them, you understand, gosh, they're not supposed to be alive. And then you see them coming at the wheelchair, and in a week, they walk and they hug you. So you live in an unreal world where everything is possible. So you only see survived people, you only see success stories at the end, and it gives us a lot of motivation and a lot of, energy to move forward.
Well, of course, if you look at the history of military casualties, The fact we have so many amputees and terrible facial injuries is, of course, because of early medical evacuation. Historically, people died on the battlefield, or if not, then often from infection. And if you look at the experience looking at the First World War, the Second World War, there is this, of course, because of all the films of heroic soldiers and battles, this myth of brave, fearless soldiers, it's all rubbish. Being in a war is terribly frightening, and the psychological impact on soldiers is huge, of course. And the psychological impact of being disabled is just as great as actually not having a leg. And again, if you look at America with the Vietnam vets, where they fought a war which nobody wanted to know about, they had the most terrible problems afterwards. And that, of course, is when post-traumatic stress disorder was first identified as a real condition, rather than saying the soldiers are just being a bit pathetic and weren't real men. And all your soldiers, I mean, as you say, it's a bubble. The atmosphere is fantastic. It's very positive. It's not, as we were discussing, it's not just about being terribly sweet and sympathetic. You've got to be cruel to be kind, as we say in English. But they even have to pick up the threads of the life they left behind when they went to war. And then again, there are all sorts of problems vets get. Alcoholism, suicide, violence. And one hopes, I hope, that because of the wonderful early intervention program you run at Superheroes, that they will have fewer problems in the long term. But again, the other problem with disability is, I'm afraid, for all of us who are fit and healthy with 2 legs and 2 arms, even sort of unconsciously, we tend to look down on disabled people. They are lesser beings. And to get society as a whole to treat these people, not as heroes, but as normal human beings with a disability, with a challenge, and to try to treat them as normally as possible, again, is a hugely important part of rehabilitation.
Well, we had this conversation another day. Our superhuman Vasil took part in marathon this Sunday. He was running 5 kilometers with a prosthesis, and he became first amongst all normal people. And some of the people said it's not fair. He's running too fast because he has a prosthesis. And I'm like, excuse me, not fair? So it's just a very big question whether it's, our superhuman, they're doing more, having class, and we were trying to understand this phenomena. And I talked to many patients, and I was like, have you ever run a marathon before your trauma? He's like, no. Have you ever went to mountains? No. Have you ever played golf? No. Why are you doing all of that now? He's like, because I could have been dead. And when I woke up at the hospital, I thought that I could have been dead already, and I haven't done so many things. So that's the second life that starts when the first one ends, and you are so young, and you understand that you can do so many things with your hands, you can do so many things with your legs, that you start doing crazy things, And they are outperforming the normal people like I am, and I'm watching them in the morning, and I'm like, I want to be able to do that, And it's just really, really, really impressive. Have you ever seen that in your practice, and people after, difficult surgeries, being, through hard treatment, outperformed?
Not physically, but quite often patients who had survived a serious illness or injury would tell me, well, I would not wish this on anybody, but I've learnt greatly from it, and I've learnt what is important in life rather than taking life for granted.
Yeah, one of our patients here, he became so restless, so he wants to go everywhere now. And his wife is like, he was a normal person, sitting, watching TV, eating chips, and now he wants to go everywhere. And he was like, I wasn't using my legs enough, and now when I have an iron legs, and when I know what I lost, I want to use them. We sent one of our guys to Antarctica to see the penguins. And my friends accidentally was at the same trip, and they said, never, ever again, I go to a trip with a superhuman. because he wants to do everything. He wants to climb the mountain, he wants to jump in the cold water, because he's so anxious about, and he's so fast to live his life, because he was so close to the death.
Well, it's the old truth, isn't it? It's only when you lose something you realize how important it is. And as you say, they've come close to losing their life. So they value it all the more, and perhaps that applies to civilians here in Ukraine at the moment as well, because you're all living on the edge of a precipice.
Yeah, we discussed that when we were waiting for our session, and Dr. Henry Marsh is very much involved in hospice care, and he's helping organization in Ukraine that provides hospice care. For me, the hospice care one of the most difficult directions, because you can't raise funds for hospice because there is no happy end at the end. So what you can show to your happy donors? Nothing, the end. And it's very hard to convince people. And we were discussing that people that are facing the death, they deserve, their dreams come true. They deserve, nice attitude, good care. And we were discussing that. And I said to Dr. Henry Marsh, do you think that this is something like Ukraine is feeling right now?
And I said, yes, I think.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
And some of my Ukrainian friends here have told me that in a sense, although it's terrible, they don't want to miss it. And I do wonder about the millions of Ukrainians who've left the country, and the remaining in England, for instance. I wonder how I understand if you have children, but it's difficult, isn't it? You've run away.
Yeah, every time when I travel abroad and I see air siren in my phone and I'm abroad, it's much more difficult than when I'm in Ukraine, because I have a fake feeling that I control something here. I control rocket, I control my app in a phone. But people there, they cannot, and they don't know what we feel here.
All my Ukrainian friends have been briefly outside Ukraine, so it's much more difficult to be outside than back here.
Yeah, that's the thing that we are experiencing right now. Everyone has trauma. Someone has war trauma. Someone have moral trauma. Someone has trauma of loss. But those people who left, they also have certain traumas connected with the fact that they left. And one day when we win the war, we will have all to reunite and start living together, basically trying to accommodate each other trauma. Do you think as a doctor that we will survive as a nation with so many traumas, so many different traumas?
Yes is the answer. I mean, one thing that's always impressed me about Ukraine is how incredibly bloody-minded and resilient people are. People here on the whole are very tough compared to people, I think, in much of Western Europe. Obviously, it depends on the outcome of the war and many other factors. But human beings on the whole have great powers of resilience and recovery. We don't realize what inner strengths we have until they're put on test. And on the whole, I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, that's what I tell to people very often. People write to me, oh, your superhumans are so brave, I wouldn't be able to do that. And I'm like, listen, you don't know.
You just don't know. You don't know until it happens.
I know that you've been through, since it's been already public in your book, so you've been through the treatment and you got your diagnosis. So how was your experience? How did you go through that? Did you think that you will go through that like that, or?
No, I was rather embarrassed at how upset I was. I'd spent all my life, most of my working life, dealing with cancer, with malignant brain tumors. And when it was my turn to have cancer, I was terribly upset. But rationally, I thought, it's my turn now. It's part of growing up, because cancer is largely an age-related disease. So I was rather upset at being upset. I felt I should have been more manly and detached about it, But at the same time, and this is a very important point, at the same time as blind panic and fear, I felt, actually, Marsh, you've made it to 70 years old. You've had a pretty interesting life. I don't want to say a good life, because that suggests I've done lots of good things, and maybe I haven't. But I've had a very complete life. And I then thought of all my patients who died when often much younger than I was, and young parents who were desperate to live a little bit longer so they could see their children grow up. So at the same time as a feeling of blind, pathetic fear, I felt, well, actually, I've been very lucky, and I shouldn't really complain too much about it. Because dying, and I'm not dying yet, dying in your 70s is totally different. And this is what's so terrible about war, seeing all these young people having their lives cut short for the satisfaction of some ghastly old men in the Kremlin. And that's just obscene, utterly obscene.
Why did you feel embarrassed to get a diagnosis? It's a very interesting word to describe the feeling.
I felt I should have been braver. I felt that's all. It was sort of vanity.
Could you control your braveness? Like, Henry, you're not brave enough. Be more brave. Or did you have energy to control?
I tried to be calm and philosophical. What I did find funny was that when I had to go and meet the oncologist for the first time, I was just like my patients were when they met me for the first time. I found it very hard to ask any questions. I was so anxious and panic-struck. We all know as doctors that it takes quite a long time when talking to patients to get them to really say what troubles them. Nowadays, certainly in England, young doctors and medical students are always taught to start a conversation with the patient by saying, what matters to you? What is the matter with you? What does it mean to you? What do you think is going on? And then you start the conversation on that basis. My oncologist didn't, but I think it's always difficult having a doctor as a patient, because you're it's awkward.
Do you know what our patients are most embarrassed to do? That was a very interesting discovery. I talked to many of our patients and asked them, like, what you were embarrassed about, or what you were afraid, or what was the most difficult thing. And they were like, start thinking, and I'm like, was it painful to get an injury? And they were like, no, it's adrenaline, so you don't feel the pain. And I was like, was it hard to accept the fact that you lost your limb? And they were like, no, I realized from the very beginning. And I'm like, okay, what was the most difficult thing to do? And all of them say to call my mom, because they feel like they failed them. And one of my friends, Sashko Teren, he's very well known now, he lost both of his limbs, and he was afraid to tell his mom. And he kept postponing, and someone wrote in Facebook about that. So she called him, saying, Sasha, I know what happened, so tell me, right or left? And he said, I'm so sorry, Mom, it's both. And he started crying. And all of them keep saying that the most difficult part is to deliver the message to Mom. But recently, I got another interesting insight. One of our patients said, I was the most out of everything in the world. I was afraid to see my wife opening the door in my ward and saying to me, I told you. And he was waiting for her to arrive because she was stalking him from going to the front line. And the moment she opened the door and she was like, thanks God you're alive. And he's like, thanks God you're not telling me I told you.
The other thing that I was very struck by when I met you a few days ago at Superheroes was how you said so many of the soldiers feel guilt at having been injured. Rather than feeling sorry for themselves, they feel bad about it. They've let down their comrades. And of course, from what I've read, I'm not a soldier, the intensity of brotherhood between soldiers is something you really only experience in warfare, which again is why so many of your soldiers want to go straight back to the front as soon as they can. And as civilians, I think that we don't understand that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. When I first, let's be blunt, everyone in this country feels guilty, all of us. people abroad, all Ukrainians, I think, around the world, doesn't matter how much you do, you always feel that you don't do enough. The only people who don't feel guilty, that ones, who were killed at the war. The rest, they feel guilty. And when I first had this conversation with our patient, he told me that I'm a loser. And I'm like, excuse me? And he's like, cool military guy. And I'm like, what do you mean you're a loser? He's like, I failed my brothers, I lost my leg. And I was like, okay, show me your brothers. And he took a picture, and it was 4 of them, all with very good ammunition. And I said, where are they? And he said, they're all dead. And I asked him, are they losers? He was like, no, they are the bravest guys in the world. And I told him, listen, you're the bravest guy in the world. You're just lucky to be alive. But it's so hard to talk to them because they also have guilt for failing their comrades at the front line, which is absolutely weird concept.
But of course, it's because for the infantry, you're completely dependent upon your fellow soldiers. You may hate them, you may not like them as people, but it's complete mutual dependency. There is no room in fighting for individuals. You depend totally on your brothers. And it's, from what I've read, it is an extraordinarily intense form of love, which most of us never experience in that way.
Yeah, a lot of them lack that, emotions, and many of them want to go back to the front lines. But right now, there are 3 ways out of Ukrainian army. Either you are injured and became disabled, you're a dead, or you got a pension. So that's 3 ways. Yeah. So that means it's, it's a long fight. And it's a lot of things that we need to consider, but the first thing that all of them say when they come to Superhumans, I want to go back. And you look at the person with triple amputation, and I'm like, honey, you're not coming back. And he's like, I'm going to be a trainer. But some of them found themselves as peer-to-peer consultants, so they still can do something that can help their comrades. Some of them raise money for their brothers, and one of our patients with double amputation, he started bringing cars from abroad to his guys at the front lines. So they all try to be helpful, assistive, and being a military guy is your second identity.
Tell me about the role of psychiatric treatment at Superheroes. How many of the men have that? How do they access it? What sort of treatment do you use?
Well, we do the first check. So we understand how stable is our patient. So all of them get the first check. But you can't get them to the psychologist because they don't want to go to the psychologist because they've been at a rough war, and you tell them, listen, you have to go to psychologist. So we use so-called first contact specialists. It's our former patients, so they are the bridge to psychologists. So they kind of tell them, buddy, you have to go to see this lady. You just have to go, It worked with me. So they go.
So you bring back former customers, so to speak.
They are part of the
very
team.
Important. Yeah.
And first we evaluate. We see whether it's severe stage or it's just depression, PTSD. What we discovered in our center, most of our patients, they don't have PTSD, but they have moral trauma because of the thing they've done. And it's against their values. It's against what they were taught, And you would expect that they have depression or, difficult feelings. And the moral trauma is not about killing Russians. They are absolutely fine with that. They are okay to talk about that. Moral trauma is if I lived in somebody's house, in Ukrainian house, what is the difference between me and Russians? What if I wear somebody's clothes? What is the difference between me and Russians? That's what actually, the biggest problem. What if I lie to my wife where I am? Is it? That's what really bothers them. What if we couldn't take out someone from the front line because it was prohibited. That what actually the biggest pain of our patient is a moral trauma. So we work with that. We had a very interesting case. We had a guy who lost a finger, and everybody is like, he lost a finger. Like, seriously? I'm a triple amputee, and he lost a finger. What is he doing here? Just finger. Who needs a finger? Well, for our patients, when I come to them, I'm like, you don't have 5 fingers. He's like, Olga, it's a 50% off on a manicure. So for them, 5 fingers is okay. It's just discount. So, and we started talking to this guy, and he's fighting since 2014. He doesn't have a single comrade alive. Yes, he lost a finger, but he lost a world. So he's had such a huge trauma, and he was the most traumatized person out of everyone, because everyone was killed. Everyone he knows was killed, and he was at the age of suicide, so it took a lot of time to bring him back.
How did you set about dealing with that? How do you treat something like that?
Well, it's a work of psychologists, and we have psychiatrists who can actually prescribe pills, because a lot of our patients have problems with sleeping. And we have a psychologist. Depending on the severity, we deal with, psychologist or psychiatrist. But honestly, we are enjoying the best patients who are motivated. People are selecting us, and they know that we are boot camp. So I don't think that we see the real picture. I think that we see the fragment, and it's a bubble, and we think this is, it's not scalable. I think that the whole problem is very, very big.
Do you have any idea of the scale of the problem? I mean, how many amputees there are in Ukraine as a whole because of the war?
Well, we have official data, taking into account that military data is classified, but 8 months ago it was said that it's 40,000 amputees and 60,000 limbs, but our feeling it's many more, and we don't know the real data.
And
that's
many of these men just slip through the net, and will they be getting prostheses or not, do you think? You don't know.
The funny thing that not everyone wants to start walking again. Mm-hmm. We are all different.
Yeah.
Some of people are fine to be in a wheelchair. It's faster, first of all. And it takes less of your energy. So if somebody says to me, I'm fine without prosthesis, it's okay. It's his or her decision. Who I am to judge? So not everyone will get to the prosthetic department. And, not everyone who will get prosthesis will use them. 60% of those people who got their prosthesis never use them.
From your...
No,
not yours.
Overall statistics.
Is that partly a question of the quality of the prosthesis?
It's a lot of questions. First, psychological support. Second, quality. Third, they never been taught to walk.
To use it properly, yeah.
And fourth, if you don't have the reason to leave apartments, you wouldn't wear your prosthesis. Doesn't matter how good they are.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest problem.
You sound a bit pessimistic about the problem overall. You're saying you're treating a very selected group of very motivated, determined men.
I'm very optimistic.
There you are. Oh,
I think sometimes that I'm over-optimistic.
Now, your Superheroes is entirely funded privately, isn't it? And how many other private initiatives are there in Ukraine? Or are you unique?
We are rather unique, but there are some other initiatives. But I believe that when you create something that works well and that produces the result, the system starts changing.
Yeah.
Because people start demanding the same quality of services. When they see our patients and they become the role models, the world changes,
But it also requires collecting good outcome data, doesn't it? I mean, how strong a handle do you have on what happens to your men once they've left?
We follow them up, not everyone, definitely, I'll be honest. Not everyone wants to be followed. Some of them just like
disappear.
Yeah. Some of them comes back, but we do follow them to understand what did they do. We try to help them to find a job, we make sure, like in this Saturday, I'm going to the marriage of our patients. So I'm going to be a witness at the marriage. That's a form in Ukraine. You have to have witnesses to get married. Do you have that in UK?
Yes.
Why do people need witnesses?
I have no idea.
Okay, so that's going to be my first time when
Yes.
I'm witnessing at somebody's marriage, but that demonstrates how close we are with our patients. And by the way, are you close with your patients? Do you talk to them?
I became closer as the years went by. When I was a younger doctor, I was less secure. I had to act more like a confident doctor. Inwardly, I knew it was a bit of an act, and I was reluctant to let the barrier down. But as the years went by and I became increasingly confident that I was reasonably good, I knew what I was doing, I found it much easier to get to know patients almost as friends. On the whole, my impression, I've only worked with a small number of doctors here, and it seems that the relationship between doctors here and patients can be quite informal. In Britain, on the whole, there are big barriers. I was unusual in that I'd often give my patients my mobile phone number as a gesture of trust, because I'd say, look, don't ring me up at 3 a.m, because I might have some serious operating to do later that day. But most of my colleagues thought that was crazy. They said, oh, people will ring you up all the time. I said, no, you don't. You don't give your mobile phone to everybody. And coming back to our discussion earlier about the way Ukrainian refugees in England complain that it's terribly difficult to get access to healthcare in England, which is true, to get hold of a doctor, but endless queues and waiting lists. But what we want as patients is just almost as important as effective treatment is accessibility. And when you treat patients, you're treating the whole person, and their anxieties, not just their physical illness. And I was quite certain that the fact with many of my patients, they knew if there was a desperate problem, they could ring me up directly, would be of real therapeutic value, and they'd worry less as a result.
It's a very normal thing in Ukraine to call your
Yes.
doctor at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, I know.
Just basically, so he's a doctor. He has to, or she has to.
Yeah.
But honestly,
In England, it's a big taboo, really, to bother your doctor. I mean, even me as a senior surgeon, I had a question to ask my oncologist, and I was very reluctant to send him a letter, which I did eventually. He hasn't replied. So he probably thought, what's Marsh doing, He shouldn't be bothering me with a letter.
Have you ever avoided any of your patients? And if so, why?
Avoided? No, not that I can remember. Obviously, with some patients, you do not get on well with them. I always tried hard to get on well with patients on a human level, but some people just are impossible. But on the whole, if you talk well to people and kindly, you don't have problems. And if you do very dangerous surgery, as I've done most of my life, it's in your interests to create an open, trusting relationship with your patients and their family, so that if things go wrong, they're less likely to attack you. Now, I mean, one of the big differences between medicine here and in the West, particularly in America, but also in Britain, is there's very little litigation against doctors here, which means patients are very weak. If a doctor behaves badly or there's a bad result, my impression is patients can do very little about it. Whereas in England, we get into all sorts of trouble. We get sued, although we are insured, so we don't lose money, but it's terrible for our reputation, and we have a deep sense of shame. And there are all sorts of official mechanisms for complaints, You know, if you're unhappy, there'll always be an office in every hospital where they will register your complaint, and then the hospital actually has a legal, it's called duty of candor, where they have to tell the truth. They have to explain what went wrong. And if they don't do that, people can be sent to prison. I mean, it's very strict and very, very different here, where patients are in a very weak position, and that means doctors are in a much more powerful position, and as we know, power tends to corrupt. And doctors here have far too much power, and they can get away with bad behavior. And as also, it means they don't learn from their mistakes. If they can brush the mistake under the carpet and not confront it, they will not learn from it. So it's not satisfactory. I hated being sued. I hated complaints. It's very upsetting, but it is actually very important.
Don't you think that doctors everywhere have a lot of power? Well, you have power over our lives.
Yes, they do, and it's terribly corrupting. I mean, it's a real problem.
How did you deal with it? I mean,
you must try to not let it corrupt you. You must try to remain humble. And I was talking about this yesterday at the Pinchuk Foundation at a meeting. For me, to be a doctor is to be of service. And that to me is a great privilege, because other than soldiers in the battlefield, what doctors do is unique. There's no other job where people are entrusting their life in your hands. And that is a huge privilege, and you have to work to deserve your patients' respect. The idea that doctors should be respected just because they are doctors, for me, is terrible. You have to, as patients, we have little choice other than to trust doctors. The idea that the doctor looking after you might not be any good is so horrible, we cannot allow ourselves to think that. And if we do think that, we go away and find another doctor. So as patients, we have to put our trust in doctors, and doctors must work to justify that and not take it for granted. And too many doctors in England as well as here, some must think, well, just because I'm a doctor, therefore I deserve this polite, deferential behavior from my patients. As patients, we never dare to criticize doctors to their faces. How can you can't. My life depends on this guy. I can't say, well, actually, you're a complete shit the way you spoke to me, which many doctors are like that. My daughter saw a doctor recently, she's in her 40s, with an abnormal blood test, which I knew was fairly harmless. And his opening line was, "Sarah, this could be cancer." It's terrible. And then my daughter rang me up in the middle of the outpatient conversation, and I had to sort it out. But even then, I didn't dare to tell this man, "You're a complete wanker, you shouldn't talk like that." It was terrible. So doctors are rarely criticized. It's very difficult to learn to do things well if you aren't criticized, which is why there are so many doctors who aren't very good at talking to patients, because the patients never talk back. Do you get feedback from your soldiers at Superheroes? Do you collect opinions and do focus groups and discuss how to do things better?
Yeah, but again, listening to you, I realize that don't go to the doctors, they go to me.
Yes.
Mommy, and they tell me,
And do they complain about the doctors?
Yeah, they complain to me. They don't go to the doctor and tell him, "Listen, sometimes they don't understand their recommendation because of concussions, shell shocks, blah, blah, blah. So not all the time they can consume information in the correct way. So they come to me asking questions, or they come to Yulia or anyone but the doctor, because they kind of, shy to talk to the doctor about that. So they find intermediate person to talk to.
But you're able to talk to the doctors. You'll tell them, you'll criticize them.
I'm a boss.
Yeah, and it's wonderful.
Of course.
I mean, it's very good to have somebody like you who can actually tell the doctors, do better or do something differently.
How does it feel? out of curiosity, how does it feel? You said that you have done very dangerous surgeries when you were not even sure about the outcome, when you know that outcome doesn't really, relate to your ability to do things. How does it feel that you are walking into the surgery theater and you're about to do surgery and you can make a person dead? How does it feel?
It is partly years of training. You gradually do more and more difficult, dangerous operations as the years go by. But it's hard to explain, but you have to learn somehow to regulate your feelings. And I would illustrate that by saying when I operated many days a week, but I always went in the night before the operation to see the patients before the operation. My patients. Because I'm a nice guy and I knew they were frightened.
You can use the microphone.
And I knew they were frightened and anxious. And I knew it meant a lot to them, but I would come in, even on a Sunday evening, because I operated also on Mondays, to say, your well-being is more important to me than my Sunday. It ruined Sunday, because I'd spend all of Sunday knowing I'd have to go and have terribly serious conversations. But once I'd spoken to them, I'd then go home quite calm. But next morning, I did not want to see the patients at all until they were unconscious on the operating table. And then although you're always anxious a bit, it's a living human person you're operating on, but I didn't want any of the reminders of that. You want to be completely focused. And if you can't do that, you can't operate.
Since we have 5 minutes left, when you got your diagnosis, did you ever write a wish list of things that you have to do?
No, you see, that's the
You
whole
didn't?
point. Because I realized I'd had a complete life. I had no bucket list at all. I wanted to be around more for my family, for my grandchildren, my fat children. But for myself, I felt, I've done everything I want to do. I want to go on coming to Ukraine. I want to go on doing various things like that. But there's nothing, my life has been complete. And I thought that was a fantastic privilege. I don't need to travel anywhere in the world, other than to come back to Ukraine from time to time. So I was very fortunate. But I am 74, nobody lives forever.
Well, I wish that at some point in my life, I would say that I've done everything and there is no bucket list for me, but it's probably in the future. But I would wish that for everybody, probably. But now you still have some plans, a lot of plans.
Yes, I still do a lot of teaching and lecturing, other than seeing my grandchildren who I adore. I was a bad father because I was always at work. So
do you think that there are good fathers around the globe?
I hope so. I mean, it was a different world 30, 40 years ago, but I always put work first. I rather regret that now. I'm very lucky that I have a good relationship with my 3 children, although they probably would say, Dad wasn't that great. He was never at home. So I try very hard to be a better grandfather. I think that's a common phenomenon.
Yeah, well, my decision not to have children at all. So I wouldn't ever be, feeling sorry that I'm not treating them in the right way. So there is a default.
There's a slight advantage in that, yes.
Different ways to deal with that. So I can tell that one of my dreams came true. I had a conversation with Dr. Henry Marsh. It was in my bucket list. I really wanted to meet you, and my dream came true 2 days ago when you came to Superhumans and we spent time on our kitchen. And I really hope that one day you will be able to come to Superhumans and train a little bit our doctors and medical personnel.
I'd love to do that. And as you mentioned earlier, although what you're doing is not palliative care, but with my friend Rachel Clark, who is a very, very famous and wonderful palliative care doctor in Britain, and palliative care hospice treatment originated in England, the hospice movement. So we've been raising money to try to improve, or to help our colleagues here in Ukraine with palliative care. And my commitment to Ukraine remains absolute for however much I have left time to live for. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Ukraine loves you.